Scattered around the world, ghost towns tell stories of passing glories, gold, silver, mining, and even oil booms. But what if I told you that one of these towns came into being not because of a government or ambitious miners, but through the hands of one of the greatest industrialists of the early 20th century? In the heart of the Brazilian Amazon, Henry Ford, yes, the genius behind the automobile industry, conceived a planned city in the middle of the jungle and named it Fordlandia. Now here's the question. If he wasn't after gold, then what attracted him to the heart of the forest? What was there worth billions of dollars of investment? And even more intriguing, what went so wrong that this industrial giant abandoned everything and left Brazil empty-handed? Today, Bello Mundo will take you to the mysterious and cruel setting of Fordlandia. Fasten your seatbelts and come and explore this story full of ambition, which the jungle never lets you forget. Number 1. Who was Henry Ford? Before we talk about Fordlandia, we need to understand who Henry Ford was. And frankly, it's hard for anyone not to recognize that name, but here goes. Henry Ford was one of the greatest icons of the automobile industry, and more than that, a visionary who revolutionized the way products were manufactured around the world. He didn't invent the car or the assembly line, but he was the one who combined these ideas to make them efficient and affordable. In the 1908, he launched the famous Ford Model T, a car that transformed the luxury automobile for the few into an item that the middle class could afford. He was also the creator of Fordism, a production model based on mass production and paying workers higher wages. In 1914, Ford made history by announcing that his workers would be paid $5 a day, the equivalent of $126 today, doubling the average wage of the time. This philosophy was simple but powerful. Better paid workers could consume more, creating a cycle that benefited both business and the economy as a whole. However, Henry Ford was also a controversial figure. He had prejudiced ideas that had a major negative impact, and his personal publications contained discriminatory opinions that were widely criticized. This makes his trajectory both a story of innovation and an example of how great leaders can also carry shadows. Now that we know who Henry Ford was, it's easier to understand the ambition behind his next big project, Fordland. Number 2. The rubber ambition. At the beginning of the 20th century, the automobile industry was undergoing a veritable revolution. Cars, previously considered luxury items, began to reach the hands of the middle class thanks to mass production, led by the iconic Ford Model T. This advance, driven by the genius of Henry Ford, created a growing demand for essential materials for automobiles, one of the most important being rubber. Rubber, indispensable for tires, hoses, and other parts, came almost exclusively from Asia, more precisely from Malaysia and Southeast Asia, where the British controlled large rubber plantations. The supply was efficient, but the high prices and dependence on such a distant region bothered the entrepreneur. He wanted to be self-sufficient, controlling every stage of the process, from growing the rubber trees to producing the final product. That's when he looked to the Amazon, the natural home of rubber trees. Brazil had already experienced a rubber boom at the end of the 19th century, when native trees supplied the global market. However, Brazil's competitiveness was stifled by the emergence of organized plantations in Asia and the effects of pests. Even so, the Amazon was still seen as a unique opportunity. Ford saw it as a chance to restore Brazil's global relevance in the rubber market and at the same time realize his dream of industrial independence. And so the dream of Fordlandia was born, a city built in the middle of the Amazon jungle, with the aim of revolutionizing rubber production and consolidating the self-sufficiency of one of the largest industries on the planet. Number 3. Ford's vision. After the dream, it was time for Henry Ford to put his ideas into practice, and for someone so determined, that meant starting big. And what did he do? In 1927, he acquired a gigantic area of more than 2.5 million acres, about 10,000 square kilometers, on the banks of the Tapajos River, in the heart of Pará. The location wasn't the easiest. We're talking about a remote place surrounded by the Amazon rainforest, where access was only possible by boat. But for the tycoon, this was just another detail. He was determined to create a rubber empire, where rubber trees would be planted, the latex harvested and processed locally, guaranteeing his independence from the Asian market. But Ford didn't just want a plantation. He dreamed big. He wanted to build a model city, a perfect society based on American values. No alcoholism, a strict fight against malaria, a disease of the time, and clear rules of morality, punctuality, and work ethic. On paper, Fordlandia was a utopia. It was the piece of Michigan he dreamed of transplanting to the Amazon. But like any great idea, the biggest challenge would be to turn it into reality. Number 4. The New Empire. And so it was that in 1928, 2 merchant ships loaded with American equipment, furniture, and dreams crossed the Tapajos River, the only route connecting that isolated corner of the forest to the rest of the world. This is where heavy machinery, building materials, and even prefabricated houses came from far and wide, on a journey that symbolized the struggle between the old world of the forest and the new empire of modernity that Ford wanted to create. The city was designed like a perfectly planned jigsaw puzzle: concrete roads, electric lights, and prefabricated houses straight from Michigan. The division was clear. The Americans lived in the Villa Americana, with running water and a comfort reminiscent of the U.S. suburbs. The Brazilian workers had simpler housing, adapted to local conditions. But Ford didn't stop there. The town had everything you would expect from a piece of the American dream in the middle of the jungle: a community swimming pool, hospitals, schools, restaurants, stores, and even an entertainment hall where Hollywood films were shown and dances were organized. At the center of everything was the great protagonist, the rubber factory, the key piece that promised to transform the global market and give Ford the self-sufficiency he so desperately sought. But as they say, money isn't everything. As time went by, the employees became dissatisfied. Number 5. Culture shock. When the construction of Fordlandia began, Henry Ford went to great lengths to bring a piece of the United States to the Amazon. He sent equipment, engineers, administrators, as well as food, furniture, and utensils directly from the other side of the continent. The problem? Few of those responsible spoke Portuguese or understood the nuances of the local culture and climate. Ford tried to impose what it called American values on the Brazilian and indigenous workers, who had a completely different relationship with time, food, and the pace of work. The idea was to replicate Detroit's methods, from 9 to 5 shifts marked by time clocks, sirens, and a series of behavioral rules that seemed more punitive than inspiring. Even though they were offered attractive salaries, housing, and free health and education services, the workers had to accept the rigid conditions imposed by the company. And it wasn't just the hours. There was a ban on alcoholic drinks, control over parties, and even a menu that included hamburgers, spinach, and oatmeal, foods that were completely foreign to the local palate. And believe it or not, the phrase "down with spinach" became a motto. Tired of American-style food, the employees rebelled and promised to strike, if the company continued to serve spinach so often. Instead of the vegetable, the residents wanted the good Brazilian beans, as well as fish and flour. Outside of work, they couldn't choose what to do either. The hobbies suggested were gardening, golf, and country quartet dancing. For many Brazilians, accustomed to warmer parties and celebrations, these options seemed out of context and demotivating. The Americans' obsession with the clock was also strange. Brazilian workers were used to following the rhythms dictated by the sun and the weather, especially in a region where the heat and humidity were stifling. At the end of a working day, the idea of relaxing in Ford's civilized way seemed absurd, and it was. Number 6. Discomfort with nature and lack of agricultural know-how. In addition to the culture shock, there was another fundamental problem that Ford didn't foresee. The Amazon was not Southeast Asia. In Asia, where rubber trees had been introduced, the climate and the absence of local pests allowed them to be grown in monoculture without major difficulties. In the Amazon, however, rubber trees have natural enemies, fungi, insects, and diseases that spread easily between trees planted too close together. The biodiversity of the Amazon rainforest, which normally protects plants by diversifying the ecosystem, became an adversary when Ford tried to impose his plantation model. Even so, Henry Ford and his managers ignored advice from Brazilian experts and insisted on replicating American techniques. They planted the rubber trees in orderly rows, like apple trees on a farm in Michigan. The result? Outbreaks of fungal diseases decimated thousands of trees, and latex production was never enough to justify the investment. This technical error showed that Fordlandia was not prepared to deal with the unique reality of the Amazon, where the forest dictated the rules and not the other way around. Number 7. Agricultural failure. Over time, it became clear that Henry Ford's utopia was falling apart. The rubber plantations didn't thrive, diseases multiplied, and the expected production never materialized. Meanwhile, the cost of maintaining the city increased exponentially. Expensive machinery, dissatisfied workers, and supplies imported from far away made Fordlandia a logistical and financial nightmare. As if that wasn't enough, social tensions began to explode. The Brazilian workers saw no point in following the rigid rules imposed by the American administrators, which culminated in one of the most famous revolts, the Quebra Pau, in December of 1930. The revolt began over spinach, but it was much more than that. The angry workers destroyed tables, chairs, and utensils, while the American managers fled into the forest, hiding for their lives. The anger was so great that the cafeteria furniture was thrown into the Tapajós River. The situation got so out of hand that Ford had to call in the Brazilian army to quell the revolt and regain control of the town. This event opened up the gulf between Henry Ford's vision and the reality of the Amazon. But the crises didn't stop there. American administrators also showed their inability to deal with the Amazon. Many were unable to cope with the extreme conditions and ended up leaving their posts. In the first 2 years, the city had several managers. Some suffered nervous breakdowns, while others faced personal tragedies, such as losing family members to tropical diseases. The Amazon jungle was unforgiving. Brazilian and American workers fell ill, suffered, and, in many cases, gave up following the American tycoon's dream. As for the plantations, their fate was the same as that of previous attempts in the region. The humid climate, which made the trees grow, also favored pests and diseases, which had evolved over millennia to attack rubber trees. Monoculture cultivation only aggravated the problem, making the trees more vulnerable. Number 8. Belterra and new strategies. After years of accumulating losses, Ford decided to change direction. In 1934, it transferred the project to a new area in Pará called Belterra. The idea was to take advantage of the lessons learned, spacing the rubber trees further apart, improving the fight against pests, and adapting some customs to the local context. Despite more planning and technical guidance, the same problems that haunted Fordlandia began to appear. The pests persisted, the climate remained challenging, and the distance from major consumer markets made everything seem like a gigantic effort for little return. Meanwhile, Fordlandia still existed, but it was losing importance every day. The hopes that had once fueled the initial project were dissipating, and the new attempt seemed like a more organized version of a well-known mistake. In the end, what was supposed to be a redemption began to look more like a bottomless pit, consuming resources and energy without bringing significant results. And it would get even worse. Number 9. Change in the world scenario. In the 40s, the game changed completely for rubber. The Second World War disrupted access to plantations in Southeast Asia, forcing the industry to look for alternative solutions. That's when synthetic rubber came on the scene, developed in laboratories as a quick and efficient response to the global shortage. This innovation was a direct blow to Henry Ford's plans. Natural rubber, which had previously been indispensable, began to lose ground. The idea of having one's own plantation in the heart of the Amazon, far from becoming an advantage, no longer made sense. With the advance of synthetic rubber, Ford's dream of industrial independence turned into a nightmare. Number 10. The Abandonment of Fordlandia. In 1945, Ford decided to end its venture in the Amazon. After almost 2 decades of failed attempts, the company sold the land back to the Brazilian government for a fraction of what it had invested. Millions of dollars were spent on infrastructure, equipment, transportation, salaries, and building houses and roads. However, none of this succeeded in transforming the project into the dream of self-sufficiency that Henry Ford envisioned. In the end, it all turned out to be a commercial disaster and a historic embarrassment, marking one of the biggest failures of the tycoon's career. With abandonment, the site began to deteriorate. Equipment rusted, wooden houses rotted, and the forest took back the space it had lost. That planned industrial utopia in the middle of the Amazon turned into a ghost town, attracting only the curious, adventurers, and a few historians interested in history. Surprisingly, the area hasn't been completely deserted. Small communities still live there, occupying the houses that have stood the test of time. Many of these residents are descendants of the workers who arrived during the height of the project. The vestiges of a grandiose past are still visible. Abandoned mansions, the water tower, the hospital, the workers' villages, and even the cemetery, all taken over by vegetation and the action of time. It's like exploring a post-apocalyptic movie set where silence dominates. Despite this, the locals continue to live simply, supporting themselves with fishing, farming, and the sporadic tourism of visitors curious to understand what went wrong. And what have we learned from this project? Perhaps the greatest lesson is that what works for some may not work for others. And the Amazon, its people, and its nature showed that no matter how visionary the mind behind them, if there is no respect, there is nothing. So, what did you think of this Fordlandia story? Let us know in the comments. We want to know what you think about this curious chapter in history. If you like exploring hidden stories and realities that few people know about, keep following our Bello Mundo. We still have many fascinating destinations and unexpected truths to discover together. Thanks for sticking with us this far, and we'll see you on our next adventure. Until then,